Mr. King is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. And I come before this floor to address the topic that has been front and center in this country since 1973, when the Supreme Court came down with the decisions known as Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, then the subsequent case in the early 90s, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And this is a nation that has traditionally, and from the very beginning of the very first founding document, the Declaration of Independence, has respected and revered life. And as our founding fathers put that language together, and as John Adams coached Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson put his pen to the Declaration of Independence, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't an accident that the order of these liberties, the order of these rights that come from God, these rights started out with life, then liberty, then the pursuit of happiness. And of all the scholars that I've talked to and the times that I've sat in the classroom and in my readings, it just never really came clear. It's not educating our young people about what they were thinking about when they drafted that language in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. But the right to life is listed first. It's not second or third. They didn't put together a list of 4 or 5 or 7 or 10 different rights. They laid 3 out in the Declaration. And those 3 start with life, because life is the most paramount right. The former governor, since passed away, of Pennsylvania, Governor Bob Casey, Democrat, who, by the way, was denied an opportunity to speak at the Democrat National Convention some years ago because he was a pro-life Democrat governor and he would speak in favor of life. But he said this. He said, "Human life cannot be measured. It is the measure against which all other things are weighed." The measure itself. Now, what does that mean? And how do we think about this, Mr. Speaker? And be this, when the Frenchmen devised the metric system, they set up a distance that was divided out to mean a ratio of the circumference of the earth in whatever manner of calculation they had. And they came down to, however many times they divided that around, it came down to the length of the meter. And then they produced this meter that was a platinum rule that was set at precisely the length of the meter, and in controlled temperature and pressure, at standard temperature and pressure, what would the length of this platinum rule be? Exactly a meter. Now, how long is a meter? I guess I could tell you. We can measure it by other measures. We can do some comparisons. But that meter, that original meter made out of platinum that's maintained at standard temperature and pressure, that is the measure itself. And all other measurements of length that are incorporated within the metric system, all of those measures of length are in relation to the meter itself. That meter stick, the original one, is the measure itself against which all other distances are weighed and measured in the metric system. Human life is the measure itself against which we measure every other value that we have, because human life is sacred in all of its forms. And then, once we accept that, and this nation accepts that human life is sacred in all of its forms, Democrats and Republicans do agree to that, I believe, generally speaking, maybe even universally. But the disagreement comes in, well, when does life begin? When does life end? And we can look at any one of the pro-life groups that are here in this country. You can ask the priests and pastors around America, when does life begin? The most consistent answer to that question is, life begins at the moment of conception, the instant of fertilization. the instant of conception, that language is threaded throughout. And I've walked into gymnasiums that, or maybe whole school, K through 12, or maybe it's the high school alone, and I will say to them, you'll be faced with a couple of questions in your emerging young adult life, and the counsel that you would give to your friends perhaps, or maybe you yourself, you'll have to answer these two questions. Is human life sacred in all of its forms? And I'll say to them, look at the person next to you. Is their life sacred? And they'll nod their head. Look at the person on the other side. Is their life sacred? And they'll nod their head. And I said, and they're looking at you and they're nodding their head at you too. Because everybody in here, your life is sacred. It's precious. It's the measure itself against which all other things are weighed. So once we universally agree that human life is sacred in all of its forms, then we have the next question, and that's the question of, at what moment does life begin? At what instant? And that's that instant of conception, that instant of fertilization. I mean, rational, moral thought and faithful reasoning comes to that conclusion. And yet, the Supreme Court, in Roe versus Wade and in the accompanying case of Doe versus Bolton, on January 22nd of 1973, brought down a decision that decided that liberty in pursuit of happiness trumped life. They concluded that a mother could decide whether that child was inconvenient, whether they didn't want the child at the time, and allowed for abortion on demand. Coupling the two cases together, they allowed for abortion on demand. Doe versus Bolton wrote everything in the list that could be exceptions. It could be the mental health, it could be the physical health, it could be even the familial health of the mother, which any of this could be affected by finances themselves. So if you don't think you can afford this baby, Doe versus Bolton lets you say, well, it affected my mental health, it affected my familial health, so I decided to abort the baby. And any abortion doctor could conduct an abortion at will, staying within this framework that was manufactured by the Supreme Court that turned the principles that are in our Declaration on its head. They no longer recognize that life is the paramount right that is delivered to us from God, and that liberty is secondary to life, and that pursuit of happiness is tertiary to life. Now think of this, that if any of us in our pursuit of liberty would decide that someone's life is in the way of our liberty, we can't go kill them. We'd end up in prison or execution in some states. We can't go kill somebody because they infringe upon our liberty. Their life is more important than our liberty. And neither can someone in their pursuit of happiness trample on someone else's liberties. Our liberties of freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, the right to keep and bear arms, the protections that we have on unreasonable search and seizure, a jury of our peers, the states' rights that are enshrined in the Constitution that are subordinate to the enumerated powers in the Constitution. That is all laid out within a beautiful framework that's never been done better anywhere in the world, in the history of the world. But it's based upon the prioritization of God-given rights. Life is more important than liberty, is more important than this pursuit of happiness. And by the way, to define pursuit of happiness a little more thoroughly, some of the young people are growing up and they read that and don't give it very much of a thought, that they say, well, pursuit of happiness is a fun tailgate party before the ball game. It's getting together with my friends. It's out in, sitting down with my Xbox and enjoying the video games that are going on. Maybe it's just listening to music. None of those things fit the categories that our founding fathers envisioned when they put pursuit of happiness in the Declaration. Pursuit of happiness was lifted from the Greek term eudaimonia, which is spelled E-U-D-A-M-O-N-I-A, because we're friends, Christy. And eudaimonia, the Greek term, means pursuit of happiness in this concept that our founding fathers understood. And that was that development of the whole human being. Not a party at all, not a joke at all, not a time necessarily of laughter, but it was a component. But to develop oneself intellectually, develop one's brain power with a knowledge base that was as strong as it could be, and for a lifetime to develop one's mind and develop it thoroughly and contemplate deep thoughts to develop themselves. That's the intellectual component of it. There was a theological component to develop oneself religiously, which they did, even though they were pagan in my view. They developed themselves in a belief in a hereafter and in a belief in higher beings. It was plural for the Greeks, the higher beings, but they were developing their intellect. They were developing themselves spiritually and theologically, and also physically. They kept their bodies in shape, and they worked out and they exercised and they competed in the sports that are the foundation of our Olympics today. All of that was wrapped up in the eudaimonia of the time that our founders read and understood. Thomas Jefferson thoroughly understood. There's no doubt he understood the meaning of the word eudaimonia. He just didn't think the American people would understand it, so he wrote in there, pursuit of happiness. And we have just we've given a short and a brief definition of that. We haven't given it the full respect that was intended by the drafter and in many cases the author of our Declaration, Thomas Jefferson. So now that I've reset this, life is paramount and it is the most important. And any of us should be willing to sacrifice at least some of our liberty to protect and save the lives of others, because those lives are that precious and that important. And any one of us that are in pursuit of our eudaimonia, our pursuit of happiness, should be willing to give up some of that in order to secure and protect the liberties, not only our liberties, but the liberties of others. And so a nation that's built upon those principles would also be a nation that would do most anything to protect the lives of the most innocent among us, our unborn that don't have the ability to scream out for their own mercy. They don't have the ability to come to Congress and lobby for themselves. They're silent. They have no chance to make a noise even until the day that they draw their first breath, if they have the opportunity to draw that first breath. But the tally for the decision of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton in January 22nd of 1973 now has reached or exceeded 60 million babies. 60 million babies sacrificed on the altar of choice and watching the prioritized rights that came from God. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And our Supreme Court got it wrong, and they set the liberty of the mother over the life of the baby. They set the pursuit of happiness, the eudaimonia, presumably, of the mother over the life of the baby. And we have a hole in our society, not only a hole that comes from the heavy, heavy guilt of tolerating this throughout these years, but it's a hole, it's a multi-generational hole. 60 million babies not born that would otherwise be living, loving, laughing, learning, falling in love, having babies of their own, worshiping and raising their children with the values that have made this America a great nation. But that's all denied. This nation has denied the world the solutions that they would have provided, the happiness and the joy they would have delivered, the intellectual firepower that would come from 60 million babies is denied to us. And go back and look and think also a good number of those little girls that were aborted since 1973 would have otherwise been mothers today. And to look at it generationally, and this is a back of the envelope calculation, to take those little girls and predict that maybe each one of them would have had 3 babies, each one, that calculates out to be, Mr. Speaker, another 60 million babies. Another 60 million. So the population of this country would be something like 120 million stronger if the Supreme Court had believed and had conviction on what I've just described about the right to life being the paramount right, more important than liberty, more important than the pursuit of happiness, eudaimonia, the right to life. And when the Supreme Court made that erroneous activist decision, they started this country in a downward spiral, a spiral where there's less respect for life than there was before 1973. Mr. Speaker, if I just take you to the school shooting data and address that. We look back through the history and the records of the school shootings that have, and well as mass killings that have taken place in schools look back over the last century. The earliest one that we could find was 1924 in Michigan. And it was a series of bombs that were planted in the schools there in Michigan, set to go off by alarm clocks, which would be the kind that we would see in the old cartoons today. And those bombs were timed to go off, and the result of that was 40 people were killed in the bombings at the schools in Michigan in 1924. Mass school killing. And that's the largest mass school killing that we could find by sorting through history as deeply as we could research it. 40 killed, bombings, 1924. Then not another mass school killing or shooting, not another killing until 1940, when an individual went into a school in Pasadena and killed 5 people with a pistol. Then not another school shooting, mass shooting of any kind at least, took place from 1940 on. It took us all the way to 1963, 23 years after that single mass school shooting in Pasadena. 23 years later, the Supreme Court came down with another erroneous decision called Murray versus Curlett. Murray versus Curlett is a case that took prayer out of the public schools. Up till that time, we went to school, and we went into school and started the day with a pledge and a prayer in the classroom where the teachers are, especially in elementary school. And I remember that clearly, but by the time the Murray versus Curlett decision came down, I was a freshman in high school, and I remember that order. The Supreme Court commands no more prayer in the public schools. Where did they get the authority to declare that we couldn't exercise our freedom of religion? Now, I've been challenged on this a good number of times in the subsequent years, but I remember them saying, well, what will you do about the separation of church and state? Well, first of all, there isn't a separation of church and state, but it's being exercised by Supreme Court decisions as a separation even not only of church and state, but church and school. Now, the First Amendment of the Constitution writes that what it specifically does is it prohibits Congress from establishing a law that creates a state religion. Nor shall, and it denies the ability of Congress to pass that legislation that establishes a state religion. So that's all it does. And the freedom of religion shall not be infringed. We have a freedom of religion, but the Supreme Court made the decision to take prayer out of the public schools, an activist act that then began to scrub faith and morality out of our public schools. I remember that freshman year when I learned this, and I remember in that classroom, and these images are in my mind clearly. It was, how are they going to stop us from praying in our schools? What could they possibly do to keep us from praying? They hadn't invented duct tape yet at that time, Mr. Speaker, but I'm thinking the white adhesive tape the doctors use, the medical tape, and I had the images in my mind. Well, they could tape our mouths shut with that tape. We could still pray silently. They couldn't stop us from praying by taping our mouths shut. The only way to stop prayer in the public schools, if we refused to accept the order, was to empty the schools out themselves. And that image is in my mind. Denison Community School, where I went to high school, I can still see the central building in my mind's eye, clearing out all the rooms, emptying the rooms, all the students going outside of that school, and the Army is in my imagination, it's Vietnam era, that an Army would come in and they would have a new chain to roll around those bars that you push inside the doors to open the doors, wrap that chain around there and put a new padlock on it and post a guard in Army uniform outside those doors, every entrance into that school. That's the only way they could have stopped prayer in that public school. But they stopped it because we accepted the order of the Supreme Court. We accepted the beginning of the degradation of the moral core of America that was being taught in nearly every public school in America at that time. We revered our faith. We understood our history. We knew that our founding fathers that put this country together, that I believe were moved around like men on a chessboard by the hand of God. I believe the Declaration is written not with divine inspiration like the Bible, but with divine guidance, just a little bit lower standard of proof. We're gifted in this country with the divine grace that God guided the men and women that built this country and the nearly perfect foundation that they put in place in the Declaration and in also the Constitution. But we let the Supreme Court, that was never designed to be the most powerful of the three branches of government, we let the Supreme Court rule. And then now, today, we teach in those schools that there's three equal branches of government. They're not equal. They were not designed to be equal. The Founding Fathers put them together that the judicial branch of government was designed to be the weakest of the three branches of government. And they were not even the branch of government that was designed to come down with the rule on what's constitutional and what's unconstitutional. The Constitution requires that Congress establish a Supreme Court. And I have made this case to, God rest his soul, Justice Scalia, an awfully hard man to say goodbye to for all that he has done for our country and all the clarity that he has brought to the understanding of the Constitution. And I'm grateful that Justice Gorsuch is there to replace him and picking up on the things that are so well perfected by Justice Scalia. But in a meeting with 30 or 40 other members here several years ago, I made the point, Mr. Speaker, to Justice Scalia, and I said to him that Congress is the most powerful branch of government, the legislative branch of government, and the House in particular, because all spending bills have to start here. And the Constitution doesn't require that we establish all of the federal circuits that are out there or the federal district courts below that. The Congress only, and this is how I put it to Justice Scalia, Congress is only required to establish a Supreme Court. And we could abolish all of the other federal districts if we chose to do so. In fact, Congress did abolish 2 judicial districts back in about 1802. That's a pattern. It's been established. So if Congress decided to do so, we could weaken the judicial branch of government, and we could reduce the judicial branch of government down to just a Supreme Court, because it requires that constitutionally we're required to establish a Supreme Court. But there's nothing that requires us to build a building, fund a building, or to fund an administrative staff and team for them. And so I said to Justice Scalia, we could eliminate all the federal courts except the Supreme Court. We could reduce the Supreme Court down to the Chief Justice at his own card table with his own candle, no staff. And I think it was a bit of a surprise for the very glib Justice Scalia to hear that out of a member of Congress, especially in a setting that was, I'll say, quasi-public at least. And he thought for a little bit. I'm not sure if he'd ever thought about what I had presented to him, Mr. Speaker, but he thought for a little bit and he said, well, I would argue that you could reduce the Supreme Court down to 3 justices, because otherwise, if you don't have anything but a Supreme Court, a Chief Justice, there's nothing to be the chief of. So I would argue for 3 justices. And I said, well, Justice Scalia, there have always been too many chiefs and not enough Indians, and we more or less declared the case ready to move on for further discussion. But the point of this exercise, Mr. Speaker, is to make the point that the court's power exists because Congress empowers it. And if there is a struggle between the legislative branch of government, Article 1, or the executive branch of government, Article 2, or the judicial branch of government, Article 3, I would remind the folks involved in any discussion like that the branches of government were prioritized in the Constitution in the same fashion that the God-given rights are prioritized in the Declaration. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. In the Constitution, Article 1, 2, 3, legislative, executive, judicial branch of government, prioritized, because our Founding Fathers envisioned that there would be a struggle between the 3 branches of government. And they wanted to set up a static power base so that they expected that each branch of government would jealously protect its constitutional authority. And there would be that tug of war, a struggle, ethically and peacefully, they hoped, between each branch of government. That's why they put the checks and balances in place. They gave the legislative authority to the United States Congress, and the spending authority to Congress, and the initiation of all bills that initiate spending to the House of Representatives. And they didn't give it to the Senate because we were to be the hot cup of coffee, and they were to be, the Senate was to be the saucer that coffee cooled in. That's why we're 2-year terms here, 6-year terms over in the Senate. But they wanted a legislative body that would be a quick reaction force, a fast response. If things got out of whack, if they needed to be addressed quickly, then they wanted the House of Representatives to perhaps turn over quickly so that the House could respond to these issues in a fast way. But they wanted a judicial body, that legislative body, that could sit back, maybe fold their arms a little bit, and wait and be patient and think things through, so it wasn't just emotional. It was also kind of a hard-charging reaction force in the House, and seasoned by experience, I might add, Mr. Speaker, and a more careful, slower-moving body in the Senate, which I think they clearly achieved, a more careful, slower-moving body in the Senate. But one of those examples that's a modern day, when things went against the American people in the elections of 2010, around March 23rd of 2010, it was March 23rd, the final passage of Obamacare passed out from the Senate and the House to President Obama's desk, and he signed that bill as fast as he could get his signature on it. I guess, but the American people had rejected a federal government takeover of our health insurance, at least as a minimum. And I've long said that our soul is the most sovereign thing that we have. And the government hasn't figured out how to nationalize that yet, and I don't believe they ever will. Second thing, the most sovereignty that we have is our bodies, our skin, and everything inside it. But Obamacare nationalized was a federal takeover of the management of our body, our skin and everything inside it. Took out of our hands the ability to manage our own health in a free market system, and the public rejected such an idea. They rejected Obamacare. March 23rd, it passed and was signed into law. That election that ensued the following November brought 87 freshman Republicans to the House of Representatives. Every one of them pledged, and every one of them ran on the ticket to 100% rip it out by the roots, repeal Obamacare. That's the reaction of the public when this body here was not responding to the will of the people. They changed that over in the very next election, which was just months later, from the 3rd month to the 11th month. So you're only in 8 months later, the election had taken place, and we had 87 new freshman Republicans on the way. And we didn't get as far as we needed to get. We didn't get it fully ripped out by the roots as I wanted to do, but you can see the effects of that election to this day, Mr. Speaker. That's how our founding fathers envisioned it would work. The House of Representatives be a quick reaction force. They reacted quickly in the 2010 election. The American people weighed in. When the executive branch gets out of line, there are provisions there. If there's going to be impeachment, the House has to initiate that impeachment. But over in the Senate, the impeachment doesn't remove a president from office. I believe it constitutionally requires a trial in the Senate. But to remove a president from office takes a 2/3 majority in the United States Senate. I don't think they served us very well in 1998 when the impeachment went before the United States Senate, when William Jefferson Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives, because the trial in the Senate didn't bring us the verdict. It put all the questions together, and instead of asking the question, did he commit the acts that the House had indicted him for, and in a separate question, should he be removed from office for that, they jammed those questions together, and it gave some of the Democrat senators a way out. They didn't have to answer the question whether they believed he was guilty or not. So they never really heard the case and gave us a verdict on the conclusion. It was inconclusive in the Senate, and I think that the way they framed those questions that were voted upon by the senators, I think it was a disservice to the American people, a disservice to our Constitution. But nonetheless, there's a check and a balance. If a president gets out of line, if his executive branch gets out of line, the House of Representatives can initiate impeachment. The House of Representatives can shut off all funding to that branch of government, or, well, it wouldn't do that, obviously, but to a division within that branch of government. We can cut the funding to bring about the result that's necessary if we have the conviction here, and if we believe it's prudent policy, the House controls the spending, the House initiates any impeachment that might be required, and we don't want to ever exercise that unless it's judiciously done for good reason and good cause. And the Senate, the prudent group of the Senate, come up for election every 6 years, so they can sit back a little bit. Only a third of them have the level of apprehension that all of those that are up for re-election in the House of Representatives do. But this balance, this check and balance between the three branches of government was that the branch of government and the division within it, the legislative branch and the U.S. House of Representatives, the division within it, was always designed to be able to control the other branches of government, and by the way, able to limit the United States Senate. And the reasons for that are why we're up for election every 2 years, so the people would be sovereign. We, the people, are the ones that really do decide who's right in all of this Republican form of government, which is guaranteed to the American people in the Constitution. We are guaranteed, Mr. Speaker, a Republican form of government. But in this form of government, it is we, the people. And we, the legislators within the United States House of Representatives, are the most accountable to the people. And by that, we need to be the most responsive to the people as well. And I think history has proven that out. And so it doesn't either mean that the Supreme Court gets to decide necessarily what the Constitution means. I will define what it means here, Mr. Speaker, and that is the Constitution has to mean what it says. It has to mean literally what it says, but it has to also mean what it was understood to mean at the time of its ratification. Every one of us takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Here in the House, 435 of us, and over in the Senate, 100 senators, and a good number of executive branch employees a long ways down the line take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, I take that oath seriously, and I carry a Constitution in my jacket pocket every day, as close to my heart as it can get, to remember what this means, what it means to me. But I don't take the oath to support and defend the Constitution with the idea in mind that I'm going to shift my oath and the meaning of my oath to conform to a Supreme Court decision that does not reflect the original understanding of the Constitution. None of us can take an oath to a living, breathing, moving interpretation of a document. This Constitution, Mr. Speaker, this Constitution constitutes a contractual guarantee, from the intergenerational contractual guarantee, that this God-given liberty that's defined in our Declaration and the Bill of Rights and the structure of our government and the function of our government and the enumerated powers that are in here, that this is an intergenerational contractual guarantee passed down to us generation to generation. And it can't change its meaning just because 5 justices over there in the Supreme Court decide it changes its meaning. Now, I want to respect their jurisprudence, and I respect almost all of the decisions that have come down. But there have been times in history when an activist court has decided they're going to rewrite this society according to their whim. And I've always admired Congressman Louie Gohmert of Texas, who is a former judge. And he came to this Congress and he ran on this ticket. And he's been to Iowa a few times and he's coming back. He says this: I found myself on the bench as a judge, and I was constrained to interpret the literal meaning of the Constitution and interpret the literal meaning of the laws that were passed. And when I felt the urge to be a legislator, I knew my obligation then was to leave the bench and run for Congress. That's what you need to do when you feel in your heart that you're a legislator, when you reason that you can do more to contribute as a legislator than you can as a judge. So Louie Gohmert came to this Congress, Congressman Louie Gohmert came to this Congress in the right way for the right reasons to legislate, because that was his heart's desire, and it's where he believed, and I hope today still believes, that he can do the most good for this country. But the justices that sit on the bench that decide that they can just ignore the meaning of the Constitution are undermining our God-given liberty. They're undermining the foundation delivered to us by the founders. They're undermining the Declaration. They're undermining the Constitution itself. And I can think of a few of those decisions. The Kelo decision, when the Supreme Court ruled that private property could be confiscated, condemned through eminent domain by a local jurisdiction of government and then handed over to another private interest. Let's just say that there's a widow lady that lives in a certain section of town and she wants to live in that house the rest of her life, but there are developers that own the rest of the land around her and they want to put in a shopping mall. And so they would come in and say to the lady, hey, here's our offer, we want to buy your house. And she says, no amount of money can buy my house. I'm going to live in this house the rest of my life. Well, in the Kelo decision, they went to government. Government condemned the property, took that property away from her. It was litigated all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that local government could condemn property under the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, which says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And think of this. They didn't say, nor shall private property be condemned and handed over to other private interests without just compensation, because the Founding Fathers never imagined that government would have the audacity to condemn private property to hand it over to other private interests. But the function of that decision was, so now the effect of the Kelo decision is, the Fifth Amendment now reads, in effect, de facto we say, nor shall private property be taken without just compensation. They struck out those three words for public use. That's the effect of a Supreme Court decision. It is an erroneous decision. It's a wrong decision. It doesn't reflect the language in the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. The dissent was written by Justice O'Connor. I didn't know till after I'd made my statement on the floor after that decision that her dissent mirrored almost exactly the statement that I made on the floor in rejection of it. And I didn't expect the gentleman at that time from Massachusetts, Barney Frank, to agree with me either. But Barney Frank, Justice O'Connor, Steve King, and many others agreed. An erroneous decision. A Supreme Court amended the Constitution. In effect, they de facto amended the Constitution of the United States by coming down with a decision that effectively struck the words for public use out of the Fifth Amendment. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So now they're taking, they have what they are their extra constitutional takings of private property handed over to private property because local government has concluded they can collect more tax dollars off of that private interest that wants to build a shopping mall or a truck stop or whatever it might be to expand. That's the kind of decisions that a Supreme Court can make that are activist decisions that effectively amend our Constitution if we let them do that. So, when we think of a decision like Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, how'd they cook that up? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from out of the emanations and the penumbras, Mr. Speaker. And it's rooted back in a decision called the Griswold decision from the 60s. I believe it was 1964. Connecticut at that time, a strong Catholic state, had decided that they would not allow for contraceptives to be sold in Connecticut. And the Griswold couple, husband and wife, decided that they had a right to privacy to purchase contraceptives to exercise their liberties. Now, that decision that was made by the state of Connecticut not to sell contraceptives was a part of the laboratory of the states. It's the state's rights to pass a decision like that. And as soon as the people in the state of Connecticut decided they rejected that decision, they can elect some new people to their legislature. But this was litigated to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States decided that that couple, the Griswold couple, had a right to privacy, and that right to privacy included the right to purchase contraceptives. And so they created a new right, a right to privacy. They created it out of thin air, which we now call out of the emanations and penumbras. That's the little shadow around the edge of the cloud that maybe a justice in a black robe can see, but the rest of us lay people or even the brightest attorneys in the land can't quite see because they aren't seated on the Supreme Court. Well, if you can find rights out of the emanations and penumbras that you can't find in the very language of the Constitution or statute for that matter, you are an activist judge. and you're trying to alter our society, amend our society into your own fashion. You're legislating from the bench. So they created a right to privacy. And this right to privacy was then used as the foundation of the decision in Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton that granted, the couple of those two cases together, abortion on demand. Abortion on demand, at least before viability. And the viability is a very vague measure of a baby that would be able to survive outside the womb. Now, that length of maturity within the womb and the ability to survive outside the womb has changed substantially, Mr. Speaker, since Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. Now we have babies that have survived clear down as early as into the 20th week. Viability has changed because medicine has gotten ahead of this, and we have saved more babies. But viability wasn't the only measure, because Doe versus Bolton gave all the exceptions that I talked about earlier, the exceptions for the health of the mother, the physical health, the mental health, the familial health, the financial health, anything that might affect her psyche. If it was, so it amounts to abortion on demand, for the sake of, let's wait until it's convenient, and to take the life of that innocent little baby. But what we see now, Mr. Speaker, what we see now is that we're watching these babies grow in the womb and in the ultrasound. And my iPhone has a number of little babies and the ultrasounds in it. And you can watch as those little babies will squirm and reach their arm out, suck their thumb. They look like they're trying to talk, stretch their legs out. They move around a lot more than we ever thought they did. And I talk to mothers that say, as they watch their little baby that is 19, 20 weeks along, squirming around in the ultrasound, and a lot of the time they can't yet feel that movement. We know that as we get later on, even us dads get to feel that movement, and it is a glorious thing. This is a development of the miracle. It is, and you can't be a parent or a grandparent and hold a little baby that is flesh of your flesh and not be amazed at the miracle of a little baby. And when I took my firstborn in my hands, little David Stephen King, and put him in my hands and looked at him, it was with awe that I saw so many pieces about him. Count the fingers and toes, take a look at his eyes, see every little feature that's there. And that little son and I began to ask that question shortly after his birth. Could anyone take his life now? Within minutes after he was born, as squirmy and beautiful and miraculous, created in God's image as he was? Could anybody take his life then? I don't know anybody that have ghastly enough that could do so. So I thought, if he's 20 minutes old and we can't take his life, if he's 5 minutes old and we can't take his life, if he's 1 minute old and we can't take his life, how could we take it a minute before he was born? Or 5 minutes? Or an hour? Or a day? Or a week? Or a month? Where along this continuum from this moment of conception would there be a time that we could say, oh, he's only a blob of tissue? He was never a blob of tissue. He was always a unique human being, joining together the DNA of his mother and his father in a unique fashion that would never be matched again. Mr. Speaker, think of this. 7 billion people on the planet, everyone unique, even the identical twins, the identical quadruplets that are there. Their mother can tell them apart. Their father can tell them apart most of the time, and the older they get, the easier it is. But 7 billion faces on this planet, and God created those faces to be unique. No two faces are the same, even if their DNA is matched up in identical twins, or identical quadruplets, or identical triplets, as rare as they are. Their mothers can look them in the face and know which child is which. The rest of us can figure out everybody else, and we can a lot of times figure out the twins too. And I have twin nieces that I could always tell apart. They'd ask me how I could, and I'd say, well, one of you is really intelligent, and the other is really beautiful. You two figure out which is which. I'm not going to answer the question. But we can tell them apart. Now, what a gift from God to the creation, to have the imagination, to create faces. Everyone unique, no matter how many people on the planet there are, just the facial features are unique, let alone all the rest of us, let alone all the things that go on in our heads and in our minds and the experiences we have, the personalities that develop differently, that combination of nature and nurture that will never unlock the mystery of that. That's all a gift from God. And we've aborted 60 million of the gift from God. 60 million, and another 60 million babies not born because their mothers were aborted. Children that never had the opportunity to live, to draw that first breath of free air. And when I welcome a new grandchild into the world, I say a prayer over them, Mr. Speaker. And I pray that they live a long and a healthy life, a faithful life, and a life that is long and healthy and faithful. And when that day comes that they're called home at the end of that long and healthy and faithful life, I pray that the last breath that they draw is more free than the first breaths that they are drawing on that day. And that's what we need to work for. More freedom, more God-given liberty, more young lives brought into this world. The very source of all joy comes from little babies, from our children. And if we stopped having babies, the joy would finally just die down. The laughter, the giggling would just diminish day by day by day until there was no joy left in the world, because that's the source of it. And yet, we're aborting 1 million babies a year. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, I brought the heartbeat bill to this House of Representatives. H.R. 490, the Heartbeat Protection Act. That's why we've worked so hard to get co-sponsors on this legislation. We worked so hard to get the co-sponsors and people like former Majority Leader Tom DeLay came here to work pro bono. The leader of Faith to Action, Janet Porter, a driving force, worked to get co-sponsors on this legislation, worked to send the messages in the right place. We carefully drafted language that reflects our intent to save the lives of as many babies as we can from the moment of the heartbeat. And we require that if the abortionist is intending to commit an abortion, he must first check for a heartbeat. And that heartbeat would be detected at 7 to 8 weeks. If a heartbeat can be detected, the baby is protected. Because we know that's a unique human being, a sacred human life. And I would like to go back to the moment of conception, but we can't yet medically identify that moment. But we can identify when a heartbeat can be detected. And we all know, if there's a beating heart, there's a baby there. That heart doesn't just sit down there on its own beating away. It's in the chest of a baby. A little baby, a little unique boy or a girl, that's a gift from God. And that baby has at least a 95% chance of successful birth once we can detect that heartbeat in the womb. And so how could we allow for the ending of that unique human being's life without that baby not ever having a chance to draw a breath of free air, to scream for its own mercy? How could we say no to that? How could we have in our earpieces the sound, that ultrasound of that beating heart? My little granddaughter is 20 weeks along and her heart's beating, last week anyway, at 161 beats per minute. And that beat is strong and firm and solid. And she's got at least a 95% chance of successful birth and being welcomed into this world, drawing that breath of free air. And I will pray is freer still on her last day, many, many years from now. But we need to get there. We need to protect these lives, and we need to get a bill before the Supreme Court. And so here in this House, we're 170 co-sponsors strong. We're far ahead of any other significant piece of pro-life legislation. I drafted the bill with the strategy in mind, Mr. Speaker, to get the heartbeat bill before the Supreme Court, after the next appointment to the Supreme Court. I'm very pleased with what I see with Neil Gorsuch. And when I hear the rumors of the potential retirements in the Supreme Court, our three oldest members of the Supreme Court are 84, 80, and 78 years old, Mr. Speaker. So we can expect a retirement fairly soon. And we need to have a bill out of the House of Representatives sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk long enough and hard enough that we can gin up the effort to get it passed out of the United States Senate. There are 4 windows that need to be opened before we can start to save lives in significant numbers, Mr. Speaker. One of them is a pro-life majority in the House of Representatives. We have that. 237 votes behind the pain-capable 20-week bill. The next one is a pro-life majority in the United States Senate. And Senator Roy Blunt made a mention in our values team here a couple of weeks ago. They have a bare majority, a pro-life majority in the Senate. 51 votes voted for the 20-week bill over there. They didn't break the filibuster, but 51. That's a pro-life majority. And if they suspend the rules over there and get rid of the filibuster rule, the votes are there to pass heartbeat over and send it to the president's desk. That's the third window. First window is a pro-life majority in the House. Second window is a pro-life majority in the Senate. Third window is a president who will sign the heartbeat bill to protect these lives from the 7th or 8th week all the way through. I don't have any doubt President Trump will sign such a bill. And I don't have any doubt that Vice President Pence will be standing right next to him when that day comes. I don't know whether I'm going to be standing there, but I'm going to do everything I can, Mr. Speaker, to get the heartbeat bill to the president's desk. And yes, it'll be litigated. The pro-abortion people will litigate everything that slows down the abortion mills in this country. And so it would be litigated, and the timing of getting it out of the Senate to the president's desk and before the court after the next confirmation means we're called upon to move the heartbeat bill out of the House within the next few months. Because we get closer to the election, it gets harder. Things get crazy around here. So if it gets past about July, it's going to be really hard to move the heartbeat bill. Well, there's a little rule that was handed down, I think, from the previous speaker that says that pro-life legislation doesn't move off the floor of the House unless the top 3 pro-life organizations support it and will actively support it here in the House of Representatives. Those organizations would be Family Research Council, Tony Perkins, supports the bill. And the next organization is Susan B. Anthony's list, and they also have agreed to support the bill. Yes, they have a priority. They'd like to move ahead of that, but Marjorie Dannenfelser said, of course I would never stand in the way of something so good as a heartbeat bill. The third organization is the one that's not fully on board. In fact, I don't see that they're supporting it in any way. And Back Channel says to me that there are some statements made to try to slow it down. That's the National Right to Life, the oldest and the largest pro-life organization in the United States of America. They said they don't oppose the heartbeat bill. Well, Mr. Speaker, this is a write-off of their electronic publications, whether it happens to be a tweet or whether it's their website. But here's their statement. National Right to Life, protecting life in America since 1968. National Right to Life does not, they said they do not oppose the heartbeat bill. I struck through there with a red line and said, well, neither do they support it. They don't oppose the heartbeat bill. Well, they don't support the heartbeat bill. They're stuck on this. They're hidebound on this. Their mission statement says that they support and protect life from the beginning of life till natural death. And they define the beginning of life at the moment of fertilization. So how can you be National Right to Life and not support the heartbeat bill? And their reasoning is they are stuck in this. They refuse to challenge the Supreme Court. They refuse to challenge the viability standards that were written into Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton, and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. If the #1 pro-life organization refuses to challenge the Supreme Court on those standards, then what they're really doing is accepting, and some would say accepting the idea that we're going to see 1 million abortions a year in this country as far as the eye can see, because if you're not willing to challenge the Supreme Court, then you're accepting 1 million abortions. That's what we get. If we're trimming around the edges with pain capable at 20 weeks, I support all of this legislation. Let's do it all, Mr. Speaker. But pain capable doesn't get the job done. It shies away from challenging the Supreme Court. We wrote this heartbeat bill, H.R. 490, in order to challenge the viability standard the Supreme Court has. We want to measure life, unique, precious, sacred human life from the moment of conception until natural death, protected, and by the way, protected in the 14th Amendment. We're all protected in there, life, liberty, and property. So all we need to do is define when life begins, and we're obligated by the Constitution to protect that life. But the Supreme Court has different ideas. I don't believe they will after the next appointment to the Supreme Court. So some of the people that agree with national right to life have said not enough states have passed it. Okay, so we went to work. Here are the states that have passed heartbeat protection language: Ohio, North Dakota, Arkansas. Now, John Kasich vetoed that legislation. Who lobbied them to do that? The arm of national right to life and Planned Parenthood, side by side, by the way. What brings them to do that, Mr. Speaker? Because they don't want to challenge the Supreme Court. There's testimony that went before the Ohio Legislature December 13th of 2011 that says we don't want to force Justice Kennedy to vote no on a heartbeat bill, because then Justice Ginsburg might write the majority opinion, and if she does that, she might take away the things we've gained. And we should not go before the court and risk what we've gained. I would argue instead that every time we've gone before the court, we've gained. We've gained something. We've gained ground. The court is sensitive to the movement of our society. They were sensitive to that when they ran up the Obergefell decision that imposed same-sex marriage on America. They decided American society was ready for same-sex marriage, and they gave us an extra constitutional decision and forced it on everybody in America. And they must have been right, because there wasn't a very big fight that was put up. But by their rationale, we're a lot more ready to protect innocent unborn human life than we ever were for gay marriage. And yet, we need to get this legislation before the courts. Today, tonight, 6 o'clock Eastern Time, 7 o'clock Central Time, there is a full hearing before the Iowa House of Representatives on their heartbeat legislation, which has passed the Senate 30-20, went before the House. It's passed out of committee out of the House last Thursday night in the last hour that was available in what they call funnel week. And now this hearing is called for by the pro-abortion people, want to have a full House hearing. The witnesses will be lined up there. They will stand up for life tonight. And that hearing goes the way we expect. I expect the bill will come before the Iowa House of Representatives, and it will pass. And watching the expressions on our excellent and wonderful first female governor in the state of Iowa, Kim Reynolds, I can't imagine she'd do anything but sign it. I don't want to put words in her mouth. I'm not doing that. I'm anticipating a wonderful result. And I believe in a week or two that becomes law in Iowa. Likely the pro-abortion people will litigate like they did in Mississippi on Mississippi's 15-week bill that we've just seen today, an injunction now against it. That's going before the Fifth Circuit. The viability standards and Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton, and also Planned Parenthood versus Casey will be challenged in the Fifth Circuit on the basis of the Mississippi law. Then that means that the Iowa law that I anticipate also will be litigated. Why wouldn't we send this standard over to the Senate and on to go before the Supreme Court? H.R. 490, the Heartbeat Protection Act, litigated at the same time before the United States Supreme Court, along with Mississippi's 15-week bill and Iowa's heartbeat bill. That looks to me like a good result that brings it from several different angles. And I would remind the body that there were 3 federal circuits that the partial birth abortion legislation was heard at simultaneously. They arrived packaged up in one case before the United States Supreme Court, and life prevailed in that case, as eventually life will prevail in the United States of America. And so, Madam Speaker, I would like to apologize for addressing you as Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the time that you've allowed me, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.